And we have some breaking news we want to share with you from a popular metro park. We first alerted you on your phone late this afternoon about a woman's body found in the Scioto Grove Metro Park. The man charged with the murder of Ohio State student Reagan Tokes violated parole orders 3 times in the months and days before Tokes' murder. 10 Investigates' Nathan Baca is breaking down this newest discovery about Brian Goldsby.
3 times Goldsby violated his parole in the months and weeks before his murder arrest. Ohio State student Reagan Tokes went missing February 8th. Her body was found at Scioto Grove Metro Park the next day. Grove City police say that Brian Goldsby was a DNA match to a cigarette butt found in Tokes' car. At the time of Goldsby's arrest, they found he was wearing a GPS ankle bracelet. But according to a state report, in the 2 days after Reagan Tokes' body was found, the parole officer responsible for monitoring the GPS bracelet did not check where Goldsby had been until after his arrest. The incident report obtained by 10 Investigates revealed 3 past violations. The first time was December 1st last year. Goldsby's parole officer sanctioned him for not living in a state-approved residence. The second came December 12th. Goldsby violated GPS monitoring rules and regulations. He failed to keep his GPS charge. Goldsby's third violation came January 22nd. Once again, Goldsby was not living at a state-approved residence. Goldsby was investigated by the state at his work on February 6th. It was determined to likely be a lost GPS signal. 2 days later, Reagan Tokes disappeared.
Well, over the next 3 days, we're sharing the findings of our investigation into the justice system and how it handled Brian Goldsby. The man accused of her gruesome murder. He has a long history of violence. To get a sense of the failure in the system, we first had to go back to the beginning.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the conferring of degrees.
A life filled with promise.
Reagan Delaney Tokes to receive the degree Bachelor of Arts.
That never got to flourish. 21-year-old Reagan Tokes' family accepted a posthumous degree in her honor from The Ohio State University. A lovely, sweet, innocent girl, kidnapped, robbed, raped, and murdered. The suspect, 29-year-old Brian Goldsby, a man who was in trouble long before being arrested for the crimes against Reagan Tokes.
I was shook. it was a scary thing.
2010, court records show Brian Goldsby robbed Sheila Merwin and held her against her will outside a Grove City apartment. She tells 10 Investigates she remembers it like it was yesterday.
Sheila says she stopped at her mailbox like she always does and got out of her car. Her car was here. She's walking to the mailbox. Goldsby comes up on a bicycle, puts his hands around her throat, and says, "Give me your money."
I begged him not to take my purse, which was, I just didn't want to get, there's so much in there. And he let me keep it, and he just had me get the money out. I gave him $84.
2 weeks later, court records show Goldsby held a knife to a young mother. He forced her to drive to an ATM with her 2-year-old in the car. Once there, he forced her to pull out cash and perform oral sex.
She did not want to testify, which I totally understand. And that's why he got the short sentence and the plea deal.
Because of that, the cases were combined. Goldsby reached a plea deal on those attacks and spent nearly 6 years in prison for robbery and attempted rape. And as a Tier 3 sex offender, he had to register with the state for the rest of his life. It was just the latest in a crime career that started at age 14. As a juvenile, Goldsby racked up a list of offenses we've obtained through court records: criminal damaging, receiving stolen property, theft, criminal trespass, and even running away from foster care. His prison time was riddled with troublemaking in 5 penitentiaries. That's right, he got shuffled to 5 different prisons because he was constantly getting in trouble. 52 infractions in all. Fighting, possession of contraband, stealing from the commissary, refusal to obey orders, creating disturbance. Despite that, November 2016, he was released on post-release control with conditions. 10 Investigates obtained this email suggesting Goldsby be placed on GPS monitoring as a special condition because he was going to be released homeless. A device was strapped to his ankle, but prosecutor Ron O'Brien confirmed to 10 Investigates tracking did not happen. On the evening of February 8, 2017, the night of Reagan Toke's rape and murder, O'Brien says Brian Goldsby was trolling streets in the short north. 7:40 p.m., we see Goldsby riding a Coda bus just steps away from Bodega, a restaurant and bar on North High Street.
Just crisscrossed the neighborhood down to around 5th and High, down Summit, down some of the side streets east of High.
9:45 p.m., Goldsby is outside Bodega, right as Reagan Tokes is getting off work. Court records suggest that while he was on the prowl that night, he came across Reagan Tokes. That's when O'Brien says Goldsby abducted her as she tried to walk to her car at East 3rd Avenue and Mount Pleasant. 10:03 p.m., prosecutors say Goldsby forced her to withdraw $60 from this Chase Bank ATM on South High Street. Just before midnight, Goldsby is accused of shooting Reagan Tokes to death and dumping her body at Scioto Grove Metro Park. 2 days later, Reagan's 1999 Acura was found in the 700 block of Oakwood Avenue. Goldsby's DNA was retrieved from a cigarette butt found in the car. He was arrested the next day at a house on Forest Street. Because of his arrest, Goldsby's ankle monitor is finally checked, and the data recovered reveals his location at the scene of many more alleged crimes. January 24th, a knife-point robbery of a woman for $3 on Brook Street. January 27th, another woman robbed for a couple of gift cards on South 18th Street. February 1st, a man robbed for $20 on East Broad Street. The next day, a man forced at gunpoint to drive to an ATM and withdraw $500. February 6th, a woman pistol whipped and robbed of $38 on Mohawk Street. The next day, the day before Reagan's murder, a woman robbed of her purse and bag on Newberry and Carpenter Street.
I was very shocked to find out that that really isn't watched at all until after the incident. That shocked me. It really saddened me because Reagan would still be with us. You know, at least there would have been a lot closer surveillance of him.
A proven violent offender, released from prison and under the supervision of the Adult Parole Authority. But who was actually watching him? Who was responsible for monitoring that electronic device strapped to his leg? Was it Alvis, an ex-offender re-entry agency that receives state funds to help rehabilitate and watch offenders? The COO, Phil Nunes, says no.
We also have to determine whether or not we think that we can, in an appropriate way, treat somebody. And in his case, for example, we rejected his case.
So why was his GPS monitoring device not monitored hourly or even daily at any point during his parole?
It's a false pretense for the community to think that GPS is going to be a silver bullet answer to really preventing crime.
Phil Nunes is the chief operating officer of Alvis, a reentry program for ex-offenders. His agency placed the GPS tracking device on Goldsby on behalf of the Adult Parole Authority, but says Alvis was not in charge of actively monitoring his whereabouts. They say they would only be notified if it was tampered with, cut off, or lost power. Nothing else.
A lot of folks have a misconception that we're looking at a screen and looking at a bunch of dots roaming around the city, and that's not what monitoring really is.
Phil Nunes says GPS is just a tool for probation officers to keep track of former inmates under their control. But it only reveals where a person has been and not what they've been doing.
State of Ohio versus Brian Lee Goldsby.
Which is why he says his program doesn't accept people like Goldsby. His history of violence while in prison and a sexual assault while committing a robbery made him unfit for Alvis's reentry program. The only thing they would do, as requested by the state, is to physically put a monitor on Goldsby and check to make sure it stayed in working order.
Well, Alvis, it has to be very specifically identifying the types of cases that we can take. Thanks to many of the communities that we're established in, we have to think about public safety for them first, as well as we also have to determine whether or not we think that we can in an appropriate way treat somebody. And in his case, for example, we rejected his case.
So the parole authority eventually found a spot for Goldsby in a temporary housing center called the Exit Program.
We did decide to take him in because he was referred to us and because he was on the streets with nowhere to go. Although he did have a GPS monitor and employment, we thought that it would be okay to take him.
The Exit Program is not a halfway house and therefore not as restrictive. Michelle Reynolds says it is strictly a housing program. Goldsby was free to come and go as he pleased. His only limitation was to be in the house at night between 10 p.m. and 6 in the morning. But Reynolds says he had a pass to be out of the house during the hours he claimed he worked. We checked with Panacea Products to see if his job required overnight work. They wouldn't answer questions related to Goldsby or their hours of operation. They just said they're cooperating with authorities.
He was not an inmate. He did not have to do things like, be subject to specific violations. The parole officer did not even put him on a curfew. That is just something that is an internal policy of ours, specifically for those that are not signed out for work, for which he was.
So really, you're a landlord?
Essentially, we're a landlord.
A landlord paid by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. $33 a night for each of its 93 beds across the state. If full, that totals more than $1.1 million tax dollars a year. That comes with no responsibilities to verify any information outside the walls of the program. So if Goldsby wrote he was working, the Exit Program says it could allow him to sign out without checking on his whereabouts.
Programs like the Exit Program, it's a business. It's making money off of people.
This former parole officer, who asked us to conceal his identity, said the Exit Program is an example of the State Corrections Department's efforts to privatize the reentry of former felons into communities. He worked for the parole system for 3 years and says it's broken.
If there's one company doing the housing, one company doing the GPS, and one company doing the enforcing, they would have to have fantastic communication for everyone to be on the same page with in a timely manner.
Instead, they each are pointing out that they did as directed. The parole board is at the top. Alvis says they were requested to put a monitor on Goldsby, but not to monitor his whereabouts. That fell on the Exit Program. The Exit Program says they weren't required to monitor him outside the facility, only when he would check in and check out, pointing right back to ODRC. It's their policies that both Alvis and Exit say they are following to the letter.
I think it's time to revisit policy for everyone involved if they feel like they did everything according to policy and they wouldn't have done anything different.
What bothers you about how Brian Goldsby was released into the community?
I think what bothers me the most is it really demonstrates that we have failed to establish a way for people to be released from prison and re-enter society in a meaningful way unless they are accepted into these reentry programs that are run by Alvis House in Central Ohio or Orion in other parts of the state. And the state has failed to create a pathway for essentially our most violent and our most dangerous criminals to have anywhere to go, because these private organizations can reject the most violent and dangerous criminals from their programs. And as a result, you see the most violent and dangerous criminals then being released into society with no safety net.
What changes would you like to see made in the way all of this is handled, and what are you prepared to do?
Where the most dangerous and the most violent criminals either remain incarcerated or have guardrails up so that they cannot continue to perpetrate this life of crime.
A lot has been made of the GPS monitoring or lack thereof of Brian Goldsby. What's your feeling about GPS monitoring?
Well, my feeling is it creates a false sense of security. I have been told that the purpose of GPS monitoring isn't to prevent crime. It's supposed to be a deterrent for the offender, but in reality, they lose any amount of ability to deter crime from happening again.
A somber procession of broken hearts.
The officer had been ambushed and killed, and his gun and police cruiser had been stolen.
Reliving the January night in 2016 when Danville police officer Thomas Cottrell lost his life to this smirking, sneering killer, Herschel Jones III. This Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction investigation shows Jones was simultaneously on probation and parole the night he shot Officer Cottrell in the head behind the Danville Village Municipal Building.
The biggest what if is this a person that's being accused of killing my son should not have been on the streets.
Neither Knox County or Mount Vernon municipal court officers supervising Jones say they were aware he'd committed other crimes. In fact, the gun Jones used to kill the officer was stolen while he was invading a home 4 months earlier.
It sounds like he should have been in jail.
Guilty. Jones pled guilty to aggravated murder to avoid the death penalty. In exchange, he'll serve life in prison, this time without parole.
It sounds like that's kind of something similar to what's happened to some others, in that just if there's a pattern here.
Like the crimes Brian Goldsby's accused of committing while on parole with supervision and GPS monitoring. It started on January 24th with a knife-point robbery. It lasted 2 weeks. Crime after crime of which he is accused that ultimately led to the night of February 8th, the abducting, robbing, raping, and murdering of Reagan Tokes. All these alleged crimes committed while on parole.
I appreciate being part of this.
So a state committee has been working on changing Ohio's revised criminal code to keep violent offenders behind bars longer. State Prisons Chief Gary Moore, who served on that committee, told 10 Investigates that alleged killer Brian Goldsby is an example of a parolee who should have been in prison longer.
His behavior was not, it was not rehabilitative. He did not engage in programming that would abate the reason he came to prison. He was in and out of our segregation areas. Yeah, I think so.
Yet the state let Goldsby out of prison, homeless and broke with little supervision. Let's go back to the night of February 8th. Here's Goldsby walking the streets, riding a CODA bus. We're told looking for his next victim, 21-year-old OSU student Reagan Tokes. Goldsby is wearing a GPS monitor and should be signed in at his home with the exit program, but he's not. In fact, on the night of Reagan Tokes' murder, Goldsby's accused of having Reagan and her car with him at 10:03 p.m., according to this police report. But 10 TV obtained another document called an unusual incident report. It says just after 10 p.m., resident Brian Goldsby calls the coverage office to say he was on his way home from work. So, Goldsby actually called the exit program during the time he's accused of holding Reagan Tokes captive. It's after that call that police say Goldsby shot her in the head and left her body at Scioto Grove Metro Park.
Violent offenders being released to the community, are you comfortable with the way they're being released and handled once they get out in the community?
I think we have a systems issue here, and I think it doesn't start when they're released from prison, it starts in prison.
Where Goldsby had 52 infractions in 5 different prisons in Ohio. Yet, when released, Goldsby never had to verify employment. The exit program told us they are not responsible for verification, only that the parolees sign in and sign out using an honor system.
I don't think you can go based on an honor system. I think you have to do your due diligence and uphold their conditions of supervision and keep everyone safe.
A former parole officer who doesn't want to be identified says it's a policy failure by the Adult Parole Authority.
I think that the parole officer and the unit was set up for failure by the high caseloads.
Caseloads in the hundreds. We've obtained records from ODRC and the Ohio Parole Authority. There are 432 active parole officers in Ohio, but there are currently 37,239 cases involving offenders. Do the math. That's keeping tabs on more than 86 cases for each officer every day.
It's way too much. At best, you're being reactive, you're putting out fires. With over 80 cases, there's no chance at being proactive. There's no chance at doing anything other than the bare minimum.
The case of Reagan Tokes was not a one-off. We found them. Offenders who are, after being released from prison, went on to commit additional acts of violence, all while under state supervision. What's more, we found the state may have ignored its own policies, raising more questions about if these deaths could have been prevented.
She was left in a field naked. Naked and shot twice in the head on a bitterly cold night. And she laid there for 12 hours before somebody found her frozen, lifeless body.
Lisa and Toby Tokes say their daughter's murder was preventable.
Please don't allow the cycle to continue.
Lisa is trying to convince state lawmakers that change is needed, that the state failed to closely watch Brian Goldsby, the man charged with her daughter's murder, the man who's pleaded not guilty to the crime.
He should have never been out on the streets, and he especially should not have been out there unmonitored.
Questions have been raised about the level of supervision Goldsby received. During his recent prison term for robbery and attempted rape, he acquired 52 infractions and was transferred several times. But current Ohio law prevented him from being given additional time for bad behavior. So when he got out, no halfway house would take him, so he was assigned a GPS ankle monitor. But no one tracked him or that GPS data closely, even though the Tokes believe alarm bells should have been going off. Parole records show Goldsby sometimes failed to charge the device's battery and faced little discipline. He also went missing from the exit program that eventually housed him, but again, faced little sanction. It was only after his arrest for Reagan's murder that police checked the data on that ankle monitor. And what they found, police say, ties Goldsby to a string of robberies in the German Village area in the weeks and even the day leading up to Reagan's disappearance. What's more, police say that data places Goldsby in the park where Reagan's body was found. Then there was this. An internal Columbus police email uncovered by 10 Investigates shows the department may have had its own doubts about the effectiveness of the ankle monitor. It states, quote, Goldsby had an ankle monitor on when we arrested him, and they just got the GPS locations downloaded off it, and he was at each of the robberies. Seems those monitors are quite the deterrent.
I seriously can't even believe that this is what is in place in the state of Ohio, especially being that it's 2017.
There were no guardrails restricting Goldsby's movements, no inclusion or exclusion zones that would have restricted where he could or could not go. And that appears to violate the state's own policy. This 2016 policy from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction states that the adult parole authority shall submit an initial schedule with at least the first week of monitoring to include any curfews, inclusion zones, and exclusion zones. But that did not happen with Brian Goldsby because he was released homeless.
Our daughter lost her life over this flawed system. This is our reality that will never go away, change, or get better for us. How many others were there before her?
There were others. Other victims, other cases all over the state that illustrate a failure to watch some of the most violent offenders.
There's obviously no supervision at all.
Rhonda Blankenship is one of those other victims. She survived an armed robbery in December of 2013 at this home in Barberton, Ohio. She is the only survivor. Her boyfriend, Johnny Kohler, and his 2 children, Ashley and David, were shot dead. Court records state 2 men, Eric Hendon and his younger brother, Michael, came into the home looking for money and drugs.
Pretty much witnessed him shooting Johnny, shooting Ashley, and shooting David. That was horrible. And then them coming back at me, that was even scarier, looking down a barrel of a gun.
Rhonda lost her eye. A bullet, she says, is still with her, just like those vivid memories.
It all happened in 6 minutes, and it seemed like it took forever. It was like a lifetime.
6 minutes?
Mm-hmm. And come to find out, he was wearing a GPS tracker.
That's right. Eric Hendon, the man later convicted of killing her boyfriend and his children, was under the watch of the state when police say he committed the crime. After serving 12.5 years in prison for attempted murder for placing a gun inside a woman and pulling the trigger, Hendon was assigned an ankle monitor through the Oriana halfway house in the Akron area. Authorities were able to use GPS technology to pinpoint Eric Hendon to this house on the night of the murders. The problem was, it was after the fact.
If more would have been done, I think that he wouldn't have had the opportunity to do what he did.
We found other issues that raised questions about the level of supervision in the state, including 1,375 ex-offenders who have violated their parole and are considered to be at large, meaning the state of Ohio has no idea where they are. Some might say it's a broken system.
Yes. And the system needs to be worked on.
Years ago, Christy Owens dated this man, Billy D. Anderson. She characterized it as a normal relationship, until she says it wasn't. It turned violent.
He never raped me, but he beat me, put his hands on me. You know, he wouldn't let me leave. That's scary.
The last straw court records show was a 2012 incident that involved Christy being held against her will at a Columbus hotel room. That landed Billy in state prison. During his prison term, 10 investigators found Anderson acquired more than 80 sanctions for acting out, including disobeying orders. He was also accused by guards and other inmates of acting out sexually.
To me, the state is not really doing their job.
Anderson was released after 3.5 years, but records show he failed to show up to his halfway house. Instead, police say he went to this downtown Chase bank, where he raped an employee near the vault. He's currently back in prison serving 40 years after being convicted in that case.
Why would you let somebody that had a history of violence and do this, let him out free, and then trust him that he's gonna go somewhere? That's crazy.
Anthony Caldwell's with the union that represents state parole officers. He says the questions we've raised point to long-standing issues.
This happens more often than we care to admit, where violent offenders are in our community, they're not properly monitored, and then they reoffend in violent and horrific ways.
In fact, we found the state has known about other problems, specifically that many halfway houses won't accept sex offenders, which often leads to many of them being released from prison homeless. This 2006 document by the Correctional Institution Inspection Committee shows that hard-to-place offenders have the greatest need for secure, structured, and supervised placements on return to the community, and that this has been a long-term issue of concern that remains current. That was more than 10 years ago. This year, the state spent $67 million on halfway houses.
Why wasn't somebody screaming from the rooftops, we have to fix this now? Why wasn't your union? Why weren't the parole officers? Why weren't your voices louder?
I mean, for the last decade, we have been working with DRC in raising this issue all the time, saying that we need more manageable caseloads.
According to ODRC figures, there are 453 parole officers to cover 38,000 ex-inmates under state supervision.
This is a failure of the overall system.
For months, we tried to get answers from DRC Director Gary Moore. We called, we emailed. All additional requests were declined. Then in late September, Director Moore called us. So I guess the key question is, why hasn't more been done before this? The conversation, he said, could not be used for broadcast, which is why we're not airing his response. But we still wanted to question him directly. So we found him the next day at an event in Akron. Director Moore?
Yes.
Hi, Bennett Haberle with 10 TV.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, I was hoping I could ask you a few follow-up questions from our conversation.
I'm focused on this. We're not going to talk about this, but let's be focused on this event today.
Well, I would say, just take a moment. The Tokes family had said that her death was preventable. We had talked about hard-to-place offenders. You guys have known about it for years. Is there anything your agency could have done?
Listen, we're going to focus on getting things better for a lot of people today. Thank you.
You can't answer a question, sir?
That's it. We're done.
The state's refusal to answer still leaves questions about why so many voices were silent for so long.
And this is the way it has been for years, and nothing has been done about it until now.
And we'd like, again, to extend the invite to the state to actually sit down and talk with us and answer our questions. Meanwhile, change is on the horizon, or at least change hopes to be on the horizon. The Reagan-Tokes Act, the bill that's currently moving through the State House, would drastically change how prisoners are sentenced, allowing them to be given more time if they misbehave behind bars. It also calls for hiring more parole officers and beefing up how many of these offenders are watched. Is there anything your agency could have done? This exchange with Director Gary Moore netted few answers about how well his department has helped monitor some of the state's most violent offenders. And ODRC was not pleased with their efforts to get answers. In a series of emails we obtained through an open records request, we discovered that displeasure. One employee writes, "This news crew tried to ambush the director here at the summit. The emails show DRC employees also had no trouble monitoring us. They snapped this photo of a 10 TV photographer after we confronted the director."
And if we had the same media attention on every one of these cases, I think that there would be public outcry for change.
Well, after the first part of our investigation aired tonight, the state started sending us data we asked for weeks ago. It shows one parole officer in Cincinnati has 150 offenders to monitor, his colleague 130. The bill in the State House right now calls for hiring more parole officers, but the state has expressed concern about the expense.